There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room when someone enters it who does not need to announce himself. Not the kind of silence born from politeness or protocol or the formality of court ceremony, but the kind that comes from something deeper and far older than that. A silence that is instinctive, biological, the kind that the body produces before the mind has fully processed the reason for producing it. That silence lives in the back of the throat. It rises slowly, like smoke from a fire you cannot see but can already smell. It tightens the air without a word being spoken, and you stand in it wondering why you suddenly feel watched, before you realize that you are watched, and that the eye watching you has not blinked in a very long time. That silence followed Aemond Targaryen wherever he went. He never needed to raise his voice. He never needed to slam a fist on a table or draw his sword in a council chamber to remind people of his position. He wore his capacity for violence the way other men wear expensive cloaks, present at all times, visible at the edges if you looked carefully, never quite put away. The sapphire that sat where his left eye had been caught the light in ways that unsettled people before they fully understood why. There was something in the quality of his single remaining gaze that carried the suggestion of both eyes simultaneously, as though the loss had not diminished his sight, but concentrated it. Men who held his gaze too long found that the discomfort of maintaining it outweighed whatever they might gain from not looking away. So, they looked away. He knew they looked away. And somewhere behind whatever expression he was wearing in the moment, he filed that information away alongside everything else he had ever observed about the people around him. History has a complicated relationship with the memory of Aemond Targaryen. It always has. In the years immediately following the Dance of the Dragons, the accounts were written largely by those who had survived the war on the side of the Blacks, or by those who had observed it from a careful distance, and adjusted their sympathies toward whichever faction appeared most likely to dominate the reconstruction. Aemond, who had ridden for the Greens and who had died before the Greens' final defeat, was available to be cast as whatever the surviving narrators needed him to be. Villain was the obvious choice. Kinslayer was the name they used. It's applied with the particular pleasure of people who get to assign names to the dead and know they will not be challenged. Maegor Reborn was the whisper that ran through the court during his regency, when he wore the conqueror's crown and let people understand exactly what he thought of how it fit him. But beneath all of those names and all of those assigned meanings is a person, a specific, irreducible, genuinely extraordinary person whose life did not begin with the war and did not consist only of the terrible things done during it. To understand why people fear Aemond, truly fear him in the way that distinguishes existential dread from simple dislike, we have to understand the whole arc. We have to go back to the cradle and to the egg that was placed in it, and to what happened when that egg did not hatch. Because the thing that people consistently miss when they talk about Aemond, focusing on the eye patch and the dragon and the burning of the Riverlands, is that he was made, not born into what he became, but shaped across years, across accumulated humiliations and overlooked talents and the gradual sedimentation of a self, constructed in opposition to everything that had been denied him. Every great and terrible thing he ever did grew out of soil that other people had prepared for him before he was old enough to understand what was being planted. This matters, not as an excuse. There is no version of this script where the things Aemond did are explained away. He made choices. Those choices have weight. But explanation is not the same as excuse, and understanding is not the same as forgiveness. And a story told without genuine understanding of its subject is not a story at all. It is just a list of events wearing a story's costume. So, we are going to tell this properly. Starting at the beginning, moving through every significant turning point with the time and attention those turning points deserve, and arriving at the end, at that final evening above the God's Eye Lake, with enough understanding of who Aemond was to see what it meant that he died the way he did. The structure of tonight's exploration follows the arc of his life as closely as the sources allow. We will spend time in the Red Keep of his childhood, among brothers who mocked him and a father who barely noticed him. We will stand with him on the beach at Driftmark in the dark, listening to Vagar breathe before she was his. Or we will trace the making of a swordsman and a strategist through the years between claiming the dragon and beginning the war. We will go through Storm's End and Rook's Rest and the Riverlands campaign and Harrenhal, through every moment that the histories recorded and through several that they only hint at. And we will try to understand, by the end of all of it, what it was about What was about Aemond Targaryen that made entire villages flee the sound of his dragon's wings? And what it was about him that made his actor say, in an interview about the role, that all this person ever really wanted was for someone to see him? Those two things live in the same body. They always do with people like this. The terrifying external and the abandoned interior, both absolutely real, neither one canceling the other out. That is, Aemond Targaryen. And he deserves to be told in full. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is where you are. It doesn't matter if it's 2 in the afternoon or 4 in the morning. I want to know who is out there. Every single person who tells me where they're watching from makes this channel feel more like the community it's becoming. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it now. The button is right there. It costs you nothing, and it means everything for getting these stories made. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Section 2. Born in the Shadow, the Neglected Son. There is a tradition in House Targaryen, older than the Red Keep, and older even than the dynasty's roots in Westeros. That stretches back to their days on Dragonstone, when they were a family of Valyrian exiles on a volcanic island, watching an empire die from a safe distance across the water. When a child is born into the Targaryen bloodline, a dragon egg is placed in the cradle beside them. This practice is not ceremonial in the way that crowns and coronation oaths are ceremonial. It is not a decoration or a symbol of wealth or status. It is the first act in a potential bond, the earliest possible moment at which the fire in the bloodline and the fire in the egg might recognize each other. If everything aligns, if the blood is strong enough and the connection takes and the egg itself is viable, the dragon within will hatch. The hatchling that emerges will grow up alongside its rider, each learning the other across years, until the bond between them is so deep it defies simple description, not master and beast, not human and tool. Something that the Valyrians would have had a word for and that we do not, something in between kinship and extension of self. Aemond Targaryen was placed in his cradle with a dragon egg. The egg did not hatch. This is not an unusual event in Targaryen history. Plenty of eggs placed in plenty of cradles over the long centuries of the dynasty's existence did not hatch, for reasons that the Maesters who studied these matters never fully resolved. The alignment between bloodline and egg is unpredictable. It cannot be engineered with certainty. Some children bond easily and powerfully. Others never bond at all, and their eggs remain beautiful objects of polished stone in faint heat, carrying no fire inside them. Yet the failure of an egg to hatch is not a judgment. It is not a sign. It is not, in any cosmic or formal sense, significant. But it felt significant to the people around Aemond, because everyone else in his generation had something. His older brother Aegon rode Sunfire, a beautiful golden dragon that suited Aegon's particular combination of surface elegance and fundamental unseriousness perfectly, and would have been magnificent if Aegon had been willing to do the work of caring for something other than himself. His sister Helaena had Dreamfire, blue silver and gentle, matched to its rider's quality. The children of Rhaenyra, Aemond's half-nephews, rode Vermax and Arax. The daughters of Daemon and Laena had Moondancer and would eventually claim what they could. The Targaryen generation that would fight the Dance of the Dragons was, and almost without exception, a generation of riders. And Aemond was the whole in that picture. Boys are not subtle creatures, especially boys who have been raised in the competitive environment of a royal court, where status is material, and where the relationships between the factions are transmitted to the next generation without softening or translation. The sons and daughters of the court learn early who matters and who does not, which families are ascending and which are defending, and they organize their cruelties accordingly. Aemond, who was simultaneously a prince of the blood with every formal privilege that implies, and a boy without a dragon in a culture where dragons define the ceiling of what you can be, was vulnerable in a specific and targetable way that his peers found irresistible. Aegon, his own brother, mocked him. The Velaryon boys, Rhaenyra's sons, participated. There is one incident that echoes through everything that follows, the kind of incident that should seem small when described, but lands differently when you understand what it was doing to the person it was directed at. They gave him a pig, dressed it up, presented it to him as his dragon, told him that since he could not have a real one, a pig would have to serve, and they laughed. You have to understand what that moment was actually doing. It was not just mockery, it was the specific, targeted communication of a message that Aemond was fundamentally different from them, that his difference was a deficiency, that the absence of a dragon meant the absence of whatever made the rest of them real. It was the group asserting its boundaries by ritually excluding the person who did not fully belong. And it was done by his own family in front of other people with complete confidence that there would be no consequences. Why was there no consequence? Because Viserys did not notice. Viserys, the king and Aemond's father, was a gentle man who had made gentleness into a kind of policy, choosing relationship preservation over confrontation at almost every point in his reign. Watching the rivalry between Rhaenyra and Alicent deepen year after year and refusing to intervene decisively in a way that might have resolved it or at least defined the terms of it more clearly. He was dying, slowly and persistently, of a disease that ate at him from outside in across the decades of his reign. And the energy required by his physical situation left relatively little for the project of actually attending to what his children were experiencing. He expressed a kind of distant fondness for Aemond and no more. The comment he made to his son at the time of Laena Velaryon's funeral, offering that Aemond might claim a dragon egg or hatchling on Dragonstone if he was bold enough, was probably meant as encouragement. What it communicated was condescension, the father reminding the son that he could have what everyone else had if only he tried hard enough, as though the problem was insufficient effort rather than the basic structural reality that the cradle egg had not hatched, and there was nothing Aemond could personally have done about that. Aemond, who was already 10 years old and already intelligent enough to hear the full meaning of what was said to him, registered the condescension. He did not say so. He never said so. The expression that crossed his face was brief and controlled, and then it was gone, filed away with everything else that was going in but not coming out. There is another dimension of the neglect worth examining, which is what Aemond was actually doing with his time, while his brother drank wine and his nephews practiced their dragon riding. He was reading. He was training. He was absorbing everything he could find about the history of Valyria and the Targaryen dynasty and the military campaigns that had shaped the realm. He learned High Valyrian not as a ceremonial obligation, but as a genuine intellectual pursuit, in not the handful of command words that most Targaryens managed, but the full language, the kind of fluency that lets you think in the language rather than translating from your native tongue. He practiced his swordsmanship under Sir Criston Cole, with an intensity that was remarked upon by the people who trained alongside him, coming back to the yard again and again, until the same movement that he had performed yesterday became something different today, smoother and more certain, less thought and more instinct. The contrast between Aemond and his brother during these years is so stark that it borders on absurdity. Aegon, the heir to the most powerful throne in Westeros, treated his responsibilities with the casual disdain of someone who knows the position is his, regardless of how much attention he pays to it. Aemond, Ben the second son with nothing guaranteed, treated every available skill as though his life depended on mastering it, because on some level he understood that it might. People without the safety net of birth order learn differently from people with it. They have to. The one person who consistently offered Aemond something like warmth was his mother Alicent. But even Alicent's warmth was complicated. Alicent Hightower was not a woman who expressed love simply. She expressed it strategically, through protection and advocacy and political maneuvering, through being the person who demanded blood for blood when Lucerys cut out Aemond's eye, through being the person who tried to hold the Hightower faction together as a vehicle for her children's futures. She loved Aemond in the way that people love things they have invested enormous effort in protecting. That is real love. But it is not the love that a child needs, which is the love that does not require them to be anything in particular, that exists before and after and around all of their capabilities and failures. Aemond never had that. He looked for it in other places and in other forms for the rest of his life. His sister Helaena was the one person in the family who seemed to see him without agenda. Helaena, who spent most of her time in a private world populated by insects and her own quiet strangeness, occasionally surfaced to say things that were more accurate than anyone around her wanted to acknowledge. When Alicent was reassuring a young Aemond that he would have a dragon someday, Helaena murmured, barely loud enough to hear, guessed that he would have to close an eye. Nobody asked her what she meant. Prophecies in the Targaryen line tend to be recognized only in retrospect. What was being forged in those years in the Red Keep Through the indignities of being the dragonless prince in a family of riders and the quiet determination to become extraordinary at everything else that could be practiced and learned, was not simply a skilled swordsman or a strategic mind. It was a self, a specific kind of self, one built entirely around the project of never again being in the position of the person who could be given a pig in lieu of a dragon and have nowhere to go with the humiliation. A self that ran on the fuel of those accumulated slights, that converted every small and large failure of recognition into energy for becoming more capable, more intimidating, and more impossible to overlook. The walls that self requires are very high. They have to be. You cannot build a self like that without corresponding fortifications against the kind of pain that produced it. Aemond learned, at an age when most children are still learning basic social navigation, how to present a face that gave nothing away, how to seem indifferent to things that were not indifferent to him at all, how to use silence as a weapon and stillness as a form of power, because you cannot be threatened by what you will not react to, and because the absence of visible reaction can be more intimidating than any response. He became, by the time of the Driftmark funeral and what followed, a 10-year-old boy who moved through the world like a much older person, contained, watchful, is patient in the way that only children who have never been allowed to be simply children are patient, already keeping the accounts that he would spend the next decade and more settling. The night at Driftmark was when that accounting began in earnest. Section 3. The night at Driftmark, One Eye, One Dragon. Laena Velaryon died at Pentos in childbed, unable to deliver her third child, and she chose her own end on her own terms, rising from the birthing bed and walking out to where Vhagar waited on the shore, calling to the dragon she had ridden since girlhood, asking to be burned, asking to die as a dragon rider, rather than as a woman being taken slowly by a complication she could not survive. Vhagar, that ancient creature who had outlived 3 riders already, and who would outlive her grief in this one too, obliged. The fire was quick. And the family gathered at Driftmark for the funeral, and in that gathering all the old tensions were present and concentrated. Rhaenyra and Daemon were there, with their children and their dragons. Viserys and Alicent were there, with theirs. The children, who had been raised to understand each other as rivals without anyone using that specific word in front of them, shared the island with all the awkward and incendiary closeness that proximity between enemies produces. Adults performed grief and courtesy. The children did what children do when they are placed in situations too large and too painful for them to fully process. They found each other's pressure points and pressed. Aemond had been preparing this particular move for a while. He knew the moment Lena died. And in the way that people who have been paying very careful attention to everything around them know when opportunities arrive, that Vhagar was now riderless. He knew that Rhaena, Laena's daughter, was the intended inheritor of the dragon. He knew that Rhaena had not yet claimed her, that the dragon was simply here, unchained at high tide in the sense that her old chains remained, but no new bond had been established. He knew that going to Vhagar would be considered theft by everyone who found out, and he made the calculation that the acquisition was worth the consequence. He made it quickly, and he made it completely, and he committed to it without visible doubt. He went at night, alone, to the beach where Vhagar slept. What happened on that beach is one of those moments in the history of Westeros that every narrator who touches it tries to find the right words for, and none of them entirely manage. The passage from Fire and Blood about the claiming of Vhagar has been quoted and analyzed extensively, because it has this quality of capturing something true about the nature of courage and the nature of dragons and the relationship between the two. Call it boldness, call it madness, call it fortune, or the will of the gods, or the caprice of dragons. Who can know the mind of such a beast? We know this. Aemond approached the sleeping dragon in the dark. He put his hand on the rope ladder that led to her saddle. She woke up. She regarded him. She blew a breath of hot air that should have sent him running back up the beach. He did not run. He tried to mount her. She nearly incinerated him on the spot, building fire in the back of her throat, her eyes going hot and orange, every muscle in that immense ancient body tensing with the full intent to end this impertinent intruder immediately and thoroughly. And Aemond spoke to her. In High Valyrian, the language he had spent years learning because he genuinely loved it, the language of the Dragon Lords from whom Vhagar's earliest rider had come. He gave commands. He held his ground. He did not flinch away from the heat that was building in the space between them. He was 10 years old, and he stood in front of the most powerful living creature in the known world, and he spoke to her as though he had every right to be there. Something passed between them in that moment. Whatever it is that happens when a dragon accepts a rider, whatever quality in the blood or the bearing or the words themselves causes the ancient judgment of a creature who has seen empires rise and fall to tip one way rather than the other, it happened. Vhagar allowed him to climb. He made it to the saddle, not having properly fastened himself. She launched. He nearly fell immediately, dangling from the saddle straps by his fingers and his grip on the horn. The island and the sea, wheeling away below him as this titan of a creature climbed the dark sky over Driftmark. He held on. He found purchase. He steadied himself. And then Vhagar leveled out, and for the first time in his life, Aemond Targaryen was a dragon rider. 2 circles over the island in the dark. That is what the histories record. Then she descended. He dismounted. He stood on the beach in the warm night air, and he was different from how he had been an hour before, in a way that had nothing to do with performance or ambition. He had claimed Vhagar. He had done something that his parents would never have permitted him to attempt, that his peers would never have believed he could accomplish, that any rational assessment of the situation would have suggested was certain death for a dragonless child approaching the most temperamental and powerful living dragon in the world. He had done it because he was Aemond Targaryen, and because the part of him that had been waiting for this specific vindication for years recognized the opportunity and acted on it before reason could intervene. He was found on his way back from the beach by Rhaena and Baela, Laena's daughters, and by Jacaerys and Lucerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's sons. Rhaena was furious. She was correct to be furious. Vhagar had been kept at Driftmark for her. The situation that had been prepared for her had been stolen from her by someone who had no more right to it than she did. Less in some arguments, because she was the daughter of Vhagar's last rider, and Aemond was a stranger to the dragon who had simply shown up and demanded acceptance. But Aemond, filled with the righteousness of what he had just accomplished and the adrenaline of having survived it, was not in a mood to be contrite. He looked at Rhaena and said that if she had wanted Vhagar, she should have claimed her already. Now Vhagar was his. And then, because he could not quite stop himself, he added the remark about the pig. If she wanted a dragon, she could ask Rhaenyra's sons to give her one. It would suit her better. That started the fight, all 4 of them against him, because Rhaena's insult became Baela's insult, became Jacaerys' insult when Aemond's language turned toward the question of paternity, toward the word that everyone in that generation of children had been taught to hear as both dangerous and probably true. He called his nephews Strongs, the name of their presumed actual father, the name that, if true, meant Rhaenyra was a traitor and her sons had no legitimate claim to anything. A brawl between children that would change the course of a war, 4 against 1. But Aemond was older and larger than most of them, and freshly possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having just done something no one thought he could do. He was winning. He had Jacaerys pinned. He was beating him badly. And then Lucerys, when small and frightened and overwhelmed, drew a dagger. The dagger caught Aemond across the face. The blade went deep. It took his left eye. The scene in the aftermath, the formal gathering of the adults to assign blame and determine consequence, is one of the most revealing scenes in House of the Dragon's first season. Viserys, who should have been able to hold the space between the 2 factions, was too tired and too ill and too committed to his strategy of holding both sides in equilibrium to do anything definitive. Rhaenyra demanded to know where Aemond had heard the word that sparked the fight, understanding that the information had come from the Green faction, and that surfacing its source would expose the conspiracy being run against her sons. Alicent, watching her son sitting with his face stitched and his eye gone, demanded an eye for an eye. She took a blade. She had to be physically restrained, and Aemond sat through all of it, still, the wound attended to, his face giving away nothing about the pain behind it. And when the moment came for him to speak, he said the thing that everyone has thought about since. I lost an eye, but I gained a dragon. The composure of that statement, the clarity of the mathematics in it, the complete absence of self-pity or visible grief. Those things, at 10 years old, moments after losing an eye in a fight, are not normal. They are not the natural product of an uncomplicated childhood. They are the product of years of practice at not showing pain, of building the wall high enough and early enough that even the worst physical trauma in his life to date cannot find its way past the defenses. He meant it. That is what makes it extraordinary rather than simply cold. He was not performing stoicism for the benefit of the room. He had genuinely, in the immediate aftermath of losing an eye, performed the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the exchange was favorable. Vagar was worth the eye. He would not have had the eye if he had not gone to Vagar. The eye was the price. He had paid the price. The math was settled. What kind of child arrives at that conclusion with that speed? A child who had been learning since before he could clearly articulate it. That pain was something you processed privately and quickly, and then placed in the part of yourself that kept accounts. Because making it visible was weakness, and weakness was what happened to you when you did not have a dragon, and the people around you knew it. Oh, he would wear a sapphire in the empty socket. The gem caught light at strange angles. The absence became presence, became the most striking thing about him in a room full of remarkable people, became the thing that people saw first and could not stop seeing. He converted the mark of his defeat into an emblem of his identity, the way only people who have been defined by what was taken from them and decided to take it back can do. He was 10 years old. And in the most fundamental sense, the most important transformation of his life had already happened. Section 4. The Making of a Weapon. Training, intellect, and cold fury. The years between Driftmark and the Dance of the Dragons were the years of construction. Not the catastrophic kind of construction that makes history, but the slow and deliberate kind that makes people. Aemond worked at himself the way a craftsman works at a difficult material, with patience and consistency and a very clear vision of the intended result. And the result, by the time he appeared in the court as an adult, under the watchful sapphire gaze and the long silver hair that was always impeccably kept, was something that people noticed even before they fully understood what they were noticing. He trained under Sir Criston Cole. Cole had been, before his transformation into the Queen's loyal instrument, and eventually the hand of the king, a tournament champion. He had faced Daemon Targaryen in single combat and acquitted himself with credit. He was a serious swordsman in the way that separates men who have genuinely studied the craft from men who are simply physically capable, and he trained his students accordingly. Yes, he did not simplify for Aemond. He did not offer comfort or encouragement in the soft, indulgent way that those who feel sorry for their students sometimes do. He treated Aemond the way a good teacher treats a student they respect, which is to say, he challenged him consistently and gave him accurate feedback and let the work speak for itself. Aemond responded to that treatment the way iron responds to a good forge. He trained with an intensity that other students could not quite keep pace with. He was in the yard before others arrived and still there when they had gone. He asked questions, precise and technical questions that suggested he was not just absorbing the physical knowledge, but thinking about its structure, understanding the principles behind the techniques, rather than simply mimicking their form. He practiced combinations until they were not combinations anymore, but single fluid movements. He developed compensations for the depth perception loss that came with monocular vision, developing a particular spatial awareness and a set of instincts calibrated to the way the world looks from one eye rather than two. His footwork, which is the part of swordsmanship that players at his level consider the actual foundation of the whole enterprise, became exceptional. His timing became exceptional. His ability to read an opponent's weight and anticipate their next movement became exceptional. Before he was 18, he defeated Sir Criston Cole in a training duel. This is the benchmark preserved in the record, and it is worth sitting with the magnitude of it. Cole had trained him. Cole had been training for decades. And Cole had faced a fighter of Daemon Targaryen's caliber and survived. Aemond was 18. He won. Cole acknowledged it. And what Cole acknowledged in that moment was not simply that the student had become the equal of the teacher, but that the student had exceeded him, that the relentless focused work of 9 years had produced something that Cole, with all his experience, could not match anymore. The High Valyrian follows the same pattern. Language acquisition at the level Aemond achieved requires not just exposure and memorization, but genuine immersion, genuine love of the material. You cannot speak a language fluently without spending time inside it, without letting it reorganize some part of the way you think. Aemond did that. He spent enough time with the texts and the grammars and the records to come out the other side thinking in High Valyrian when that was what the moment required. And the result was a fluency that stood in stark contrast to his brother's fumbling command of the same language. In the council chambers, during his regency, He used this gap with elegant precision. He addressed Aegon directly in High Valyrian at moments when the rest of the council could not follow, establishing a private channel that was also a very public reminder of who in the room had done the work. His approach to military strategy developed alongside his swordsmanship, fed by the same appetite for historical knowledge and the same systematic way of processing what he read. He studied the campaigns of the Targaryen dynasty from the conquest onward, and the campaigns of the civilizations before and around it, building a mental library of case studies from which principles could be extracted and applied. His recommendation early in the dance to secure Harrenhal as a forward operating position in the Riverlands before the Blacks could establish it as a base was not an improvisation. It was the application of a principle he had almost certainly read, articulated in some form in the military histories he had absorbed over years, that in a land war, controlling the central position from which all roads radiate is foundational. Harrenhal sat in the middle of the realm like a hub. Whoever held it held the roads. Aemond understood this. He saw it on the map before most of the council had fully oriented themselves to the strategic situation. The combination of all of these things, the sword arm, the language, the strategic thinking, the controlled presentation that revealed nothing without intention, created a person who was genuinely intimidating to be around in ways that were difficult to articulate. Actor Ewan Mitchell, in thinking through how to play Aemond, spoke about several specific reference points he used, one of which was Michael Myers from the Halloween franchise, and another of which was Robert De Niro's character from the film Heat. These might seem like an odd combination, but the logic becomes clear when you understand what Mitchell was reaching for. The quality of a person who moves through space with absolute certainty about themselves, who never wastes motion, who is in the specific zone of human capability where confidence and competence are indistinguishable from each other. He also referenced Heat specifically in the context of the personal code that De Niro's character lives by. Never get attached to anything you are not prepared to walk away from in 30 seconds if you feel the heat around the corner. That is the code Aemond operates on. Total self-sufficiency. No attachments that create vulnerabilities. No reliance on things that can be taken away. You work with what you have. You build what you can. You hold on to nothing so tightly that losing it destroys you. This code is a survival mechanism. It is not a philosophy chosen from a menu of available philosophies. It is the direct product of growing up in an environment where the people who were supposed to be reliably there were not reliably there, where the love available was conditional and political and complicated, where the safety of the group was contingent on your usefulness to the group's project rather than on your simply being a member of the group. You build that code because the alternative is to remain vulnerable to the things that were done to you when you had no defenses, and that vulnerability feels like death to someone who survived childhood on the terms Aemond did. There is one exception to the code, and we will come to her. Alice Rivers is the exception to almost every rule about Aemond, which is itself one of the most significant things about him. But before Alice, the code held perfectly. It was visible in how he walked, in how he sat at council, in how he responded to threats and provocations with a stillness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. Is because anger was something you could map and predict, and anger burned out. Aemond's stillness did not burn out, it just waited. The men who trained alongside him, who served under him, who encountered him in the increasingly high-stakes contexts that the dance produced, consistently described him using words that fall into two categories: words for capability and words for discomfort. He was excellent. He was frightening. He was the best person in the room at almost everything relevant, and he made you feel it without rubbing it in. The combination of those two qualities is, in a person with power, almost perfectly intimidating. By the time Viserys died, and the Greens moved to crown Aegon, and the whole architecture of the peace collapsed, Aemond was ready. He had been ready, in some sense, for years. The war was the event he had been training for without knowing it was specifically a war he was training for. Training in the general sense of preparing to inhabit a world that had consistently tried to diminish him and being absolutely determined not to be diminished by it. He was 19 years old. He was the rider of the largest living dragon in the world. He had one eye and a sapphire and a sword arm that had just beaten the man who trained him. He was patient and intelligent and capable in ways that the people around him were only beginning to understand. The war would teach them what they had not yet learned. Section 5. The First Blood, Lucerys at Storm's End. The death of Viserys compressed the timeline of everything that followed. The slow burn of the rivalry between the two factions, which had been building across decades of cold court politics and careful maneuvering, became an explosion the moment the king's eyes closed. Alicent and Otto Hightower moved immediately, gathering the council, having Aegon found and crowned before Rhaenyra could mobilize, before anyone on the other side could intervene. The dance had been coming for a long time. It arrived overnight. The opening strategic moves of the war required both sides to secure alliances. The great houses of Westeros, whose support was necessary for any claim to hold, had to be visited, offered terms, brought into one camp or the other before they could be visited by the other side. This produced a race, and the race produced the collision at Storm's End that no one intended but everyone should have seen coming. And Aemond flew to Storm's End to secure Lord Boros Baratheon's declaration for the Greens. He went on Vhagar, which was itself a statement. No other envoy on the Green side could arrive with that particular form of emphasis behind their words. He brought an offer. He made it. Boros, who was a man who understood power in a direct and uncomplicated way, agreed. By the time Aemond had concluded his business, House Baratheon was in the green column, and the terms were set. What Aemond did not plan for, or what he planned for, but perhaps not in the way things actually played out, was Lucerys Velaryon arriving on Arrax before he had left. Rhaenyra had sent her second son on the same errand, carrying the same purpose: the allegiance of the Storm's End house that controlled the Stormlands. Lucerys was too late. The alliance was made. Boros sent him away without the declaration his mother needed. The encounter between Aemond and Lucerys inside Storm's End, in front of Boros and his household, is a study in controlled menace. Aemond did not draw his sword. He did not touch Lucerys. He worked right up to the edge of what Boros's hospitality permitted, and no further, understanding that crossing that line would cost him the relationship he had just built. He spoke. He referenced the Eye. He made it clear, without explicit threat, that the debt from Driftmark was not forgotten and was not going to be forgotten, that Lucerys was not beyond his reach simply because they were currently standing in the same room. Lucerys, who was 17 and terrified and completely without the resources to match whatever Aemond was doing in that room, held his composure adequately and asked to leave. Boros Baratheon, who had no particular interest in becoming party to a murder of a Targaryen prince under his own roof, declined to give Aemond permission to attack Lucerys while they were guests of his house. He did mention, however, as Lucerys was leaving, that what happened outside the walls was not his business. Maris, one of Boros's daughters, provided the specific provocation. She looked at Aemond standing there having let Lucerys walk away, and she asked him if Lucerys had removed his balls along with his eye. Aemond asked to leave. Boros said yes. Aemond mounted Vhagar and went into the storm. What happened next has been argued about by readers and viewers of House of the Dragon since the moment it aired. The show presents it in a way that is rich with intentional ambiguity. As Aemond chasing Lucerys through the storm over Shipbreaker Bay was not, the show suggests, a chase intended to kill. It was a chase intended to terrify, intended to demonstrate, intended to make Lucerys understand something about what the rest of his life would look like with Aemond in the world alongside him. The sapphire for the eye, the always presence of this debt, the power differential between Vhagar and Arrax that no amount of brave flying could close. The problem with chasing a frightened boy on a young dragon through a winter storm on the back of the most powerful creature alive is that the situation tends to develop its own momentum. Arrax, responding to Lucerys' fear and the encroaching mass of Vhagar, did things it had not been asked to do. It breathed fire at Vhagar from a position where doing so was physically meaningless but emotionally provocative. Vhagar responded with the full automatic reflexes of 2 centuries of predatory existence, the kind of response that does not wait for instruction or permission, that operates at the level where instinct precedes thought by enough margin that thought is irrelevant. Arrax was destroyed. Lucerys fell into the sea. Aemond's face at the end of that sequence is the face of a person who has just understood something about himself that he did not know before. He understood in that moment that the intention and the outcome are not always the same thing, and that history will not record the intention. History will record the outcome. And the outcome was his nephew dead in the water. His nephew, Rhaenyra's son, Daemon's stepson. It's a 17-year-old boy who had not hurt him in 9 years and whom he had chased through a storm because a lord's daughter had questioned his nerve. There was grief in that face, not performed, not strategically placed for the benefit of anyone watching, but real. The brief, involuntary grief of someone who has done something irreversible and knows it. It lasted about as long as any emotion ever lasted on Aemond's surface. A moment, and then it was gone behind the walls. He turned Vhagar toward King's Landing. The consequences came quickly. Rhaenyra received the news and collapsed. Daemon received the news at Harrenhal and sent a letter to his wife promising revenge, and then organized blood and cheese. And they killed Aegon's son Jaehaerys in the Red Keep in front of his mother. All on a night that started the ratcheting up of violence that the dance became. Every death produced another death in return. The accounting between the two factions, which had been theoretical for years, became real and specific and personal, measured in children rather than soldiers. Aemond had lit the fire. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not, as far as the histories record, ever publicly acknowledge that what had happened at Storm's End was anything other than what he had intended. He held the line of his own presentation because the alternative was to admit that he had lost control, even briefly, even through a dragon rather than through his own hands, and Aemond did not admit loss of control. That was not a language his code permitted him to speak. What he did admit, in private, in the small hours when the walls could be put down slightly, was that he knew what had been set in motion. He knew what he had done, in the full weight of that phrase. He did not run from the knowledge. He did not drink it away the way Aegon might have. He carried it inward, added it to the accounts, and kept moving forward. That is what Aemond did with things that hurt him. He kept moving forward. The Dance of the Dragons had drawn its first blood with his hands and his dragon. He would spend the rest of his life ensuring that if the books were going to say that about him, they would say a great deal more besides. Section 6. Prince Regent. The crown he always deserved. The formation of the Green War Council after Aegon's coronation produced a particular dynamic that anyone who had been paying attention to Aemond for any length of time could have predicted. He was present, he was forceful, he had operational ideas, and he was consistently overruled, sidelined, or talked over by the older men in the room, particularly Otto Hightower, who had his own vision of how the war should be conducted, and was not accustomed to having it challenged by his own faction. Otto Hightower was a political architect in the tradition of men who believe that war, like everything else, can be managed through careful institutional manipulation if you apply enough patience and enough intelligence. He wanted the Triarchy's fleet to break the Velaryon blockade. See, he wanted diplomacy and alliance building to precede military action. He wanted Aemond and Vhagar kept in King's Landing as a deterrent rather than deployed in the kind of aggressive forward operations that Aemond was clearly itching to execute. Aemond, who had done the military analysis and arrived at a set of conclusions that were genuinely strategically sound, found himself in the position of being the most capable military asset in the room and being told to sit down and wait. His frustration was visible, but controlled. He accepted the constraint because the structure of the council required it, and because, despite everything, Aemond understood institutional authority well enough to work within its limits when he had to. He argued, he pushed back, he made his case, and when the case was overruled, well, he nodded and recorded the decision and waited for circumstances to change. Circumstances changed at Rook's Rest. The battle deserves its own detailed exploration, which it will get in the next section of this script. For now, the relevant outcome, Aegon was incapacitated. The Greens were left without their nominal king. The council had to determine who would govern in his absence, and the choice came down to Alicent, who had the experience of having governed informally during Viserys' long decline, and Aemond, who had Vhagar, and had just won the largest single military engagement of the war so far. The council chose Aemond. The logic was brutal and simple. Wartime governance required a figurehead who could ride a dragon, and there was only one person available for that role. He sat in the seat of the Prince Regent and Protector of the Realm, and reportedly, in a gesture whose symbolic weight nobody in the room could have missed, he placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror on his own head. And he said it looked better on him than it ever had on his brother. And everyone in the room looked at that crown sitting on his head and thought about what it meant that it fit, and whether the fit was only aesthetic. As regent, Aemond governed with a precision and a forcefulness that was effective in purely technical terms. The council meetings under his chairmanship were different from those under Aegon's, focused, direct, and informed by a genuine grasp of the strategic situation that Aegon had never demonstrated. He did not tolerate misaligned framings or inadequate preparations. He sent communications with the clarity of a man who has thought through exactly what he wants to say, and determined that every word either serves a purpose or should be cut. He managed the Lannister coordination. He pushed the Triarchy negotiations. He identified the march on Harrenhal as the decisive strategic move before the Blacks could consolidate their position there. But the Regency also showed the limits of who Aemond was when he had full authority. The person who had spent his entire life being told he was second, being passed over, being handed the wrong thing or nothing at all, was now in a position where the only authority above him was a comatose brother, and the effect of that removal of constraint was visible in ways that were not all positive. He became more imperious, less willing to hear opposition, more likely to interpret disagreement as disloyalty. The particular internal compass that distinguished between the collective interest and the personal interest began, subtly, to drift. His relationship with his mother during this period is genuinely sad in retrospect. Alicent had loved him in her complicated way, and he had wanted that love his entire life. But the version of Aemond who sat as regent was not the version of Aemond who needed her in the way that the boy at Driftmark had needed her. He had grown past needing her, or had built himself into something that could operate without the need. He overruled her. He dismissed her concerns. The scene where she tries to moderate his behavior and he talks over her, effectively erasing her from the conversation. This was the inversion of every interaction they had ever had. The son who had always looked to her for the recognition she could give or withhold now, in the position where she needed his acknowledgement, and he did not give it freely. He wanted her to see him. He had always wanted her to see him. And now she was looking, finally, really looking, and what she saw frightened her. Not the monster she feared from the outside, but the particular form of distortion that can happen when someone who has failed early builds themselves into something extraordinary, and forgets or cannot afford to remember that the building was always in response to the failing. He had become, in some ways, exactly what the cruelest assessment of what he was doing had predicted. The crown fit his head, everyone saw it, and the seeing of it, all which should have been the vindication of everything he had worked toward, arrived with a quality he could not quite name. It was not enough. It had never been going to be enough. The crown you take is not the same as the crown that is given to you. And Aemond, who had been taking things since he was 10 years old, understood this somewhere underneath all his certainty. He needed to win something undeniable. He needed to stand in the field that Daemon had built his legend on, and he needed to come out of it better than Daemon. He needed it the way you need air. He marched out of King's Landing and left it with insufficient defense, and Daemon let him march right past him and took the capital instead. And when the news arrived at Harrenhal of the fall of King's Landing, the prince felt thrice the fool. His fury was fearsome to behold. Sims Section 7, The Battle at Rook's Rest, Betrayal. Dressed as victory, Rook's Rest sits on the northern shore of Blackwater Bay, a small and strategically marginal castle belonging to House Staunton, whose loyalty lay with the Blacks. In the normal course of a war between large powers, Rook's Rest would barely register. It is not a great fortress. It is not a harbor or a granary or a seat of significant military strength. But it was close enough to the coast to provide a landing point for forces coming from Dragonstone and Driftmark, and Kristen Cole, as Hand of the King and the primary architect of the Green's land strategy, identified it as a useful piece to take. More importantly, he identified it as bait. The plan was elegant in its principle and brutal in its execution. Cole would march on Rook's Rest with a sufficient force to make the assault credible, compelling the Blacks to send a dragon rider to defend the castle. The Blacks could not afford to cede Rook's Rest without contest. It established a pattern of withdrawal that would be visible to every lord in the Crown Lands and would communicate weakness at exactly the moment when demonstrating strength was essential. So, they would send a dragon. And waiting in the forest cover near Rook's Rest, hidden from the sight of anyone approaching from the water, would be Vhagar and Aemond. And Aegon, in the books, was part of the plan. In the television series, he was not. He arrived on Sunfire having decided on impulse. This was driven by a combination of injured pride and his mother Alicent's sharp observation that the best thing he could contribute to the war effort was nothing at all, that he was going to prove himself. This unplanned arrival complicated Cole's strategy immediately and threw off Aemond's timing entirely. Aemond's fury at seeing Sunfire appear in the sky above Rook's Rest without warning was evident even from the ground below. Rhaenys arrived on Meleys, the Red Queen, and for a moment she held the field. Meleys was fast and experienced, and Rhaenys was a superb rider who had been bonded to her dragon for decades longer than most of the active riders of her generation had been bonded to theirs. She handled the scorpion fire and the archers with contemptuous ease. The Greens on the ground were suffering. And then Aegon arrived, and the battle became something other than what it was planned to be. Rhaenys attacked Sunfire. Meleys was not Vhagar, but she had abilities of her own, particularly her speed, and she exploited them. She got around Sunfire, closed her jaws on the golden dragon's neck, and the two of them were entangled when Aemond finally received the signal he had been waiting for and brought Vhagar in from the forest. The moment is described, in those who watched it from the ground, as one of the most dramatic and horrifying things they had ever witnessed. Vhagar was enormous. She was also old and experienced, and she understood combat in a way that younger dragons simply did not. She came in at the right angle, and she breathed fire, and the fire went at both the entangled dragons simultaneously. Rhaenys and Meleys managed to separate from Sunfire and dodge the worst of it. Aegon and Sunfire did not. The golden dragon and the king on his back took Vhagar's fire directly, and they fell. They fell hard. Into the forest below the battlefield, where Criston Cole would later find them. Sunfire broken, the king shattered, lying motionless while Aemond stood over them with his sword drawn. The television version of this moment is not subtle about what we are watching. Cole stumbles through the wreckage to the crash site and finds Aemond standing there, blade in hand, pointed at his unconscious brother. Cole collapses to his knees. There is a long pause, the kind of pause in which a decision is made or unmade, and then Aemond puts the sword away and walks into the trees without a word. Ben Ewan Mitchell has confirmed that what Aemond did at Rook's Rest, the direction of the first fire blast, was intentional. He has been less willing to commit to whether it was premeditated in advance of the battle, or decided in the moment when Aegon's presence created both the problem and the opportunity simultaneously. The ambiguity is probably the truth. Aemond was capable of making the calculation instantly in the moment, and the calculation, once made, took perhaps 2 seconds to execute. Then Rhaenys came back. She could have run. When Aegon fell, when Sunfire was no longer a factor, she could have turned Meleys toward the open sea and been back at Dragonstone before nightfall. She did not run. She understood what Aemond and Vhagar represented to the Blacks' ability to win the war. That as long as Vhagar flew under Aemond's command, the Greens could not be simply overwhelmed by numbers. She turned back and attacked, trying to eliminate the threat rather than escape it. The disparity in size between Meleys and Vhagar was significant, but Meleys was faster and Rhaenys was skilled, and for a time the fight was genuine. Meleys landed real damage on Vhagar's underbelly, talons opening wounds that would slow the ancient dragon in the months that followed. But Vhagar's jaws eventually found Meleys' throat. She seized her. She held. The Red Queen died in the grip of the largest dragon in the world, and Rhaenys Targaryen died with her, the queen who never was, 55 years old and absolutely unafraid. Aemond flew away from Rook's Rest, having won the military engagement completely. 1 enemy dragon eliminated, 1 princess killed, 1 king incapacitated, 1 regency waiting, a slow, private smile on a face that did not smile for public consumption. The smile. That is what people remember, and why they fear him. Section 8. The Terror of the Trident. Fire and ash across the Riverlands. When the march to Harrenhal collapsed into humiliation, when Daemon's disappearing act revealed itself to have been the precondition for the fall of King's Landing, Aemond Targaryen was standing in the middle of a ruin he had helped create while believing he was building something. He had left the capital inadequately defended. He had marched a substantial portion of the Greens' military force to a castle that turned out to be empty. He had, in his determination to face his uncle directly and win a decisive victory in the Riverlands, handed Daemon and Rhaenyra exactly the open door they needed to walk through King's Landing virtually unopposed. He learned what had happened the way you learn the worst news, from a messenger who could tell by the prince's face what it was doing to him and who would have given anything to be somewhere else. The squire was nearly strangled. Alice Rivers stepped in. She stopped Aemond's hands. She spoke to him in a way that reached through the rage, whatever she said, however she said it. And the squire lived. And then Aemond turned his attention to House Strong. He had always had a particular category for the Strongs. Harwin Strong was the man whose name he had used as a weapon on the beach at Driftmark, the name that had cost him his eye because saying it was so inflammatory that it ignited a fight in the middle of a funeral night. And Sir Simon Strong had surrendered Harrenhal to Daemon without a fight, giving the Blacks their critical forward position in the Riverlands. Larys Strong, the club-footed spy master, had been the Green's own intelligence asset for years and had mysteriously failed to be anywhere when King's Landing fell. The whole family wore the name that had been the sound of Aemond's worst childhood moment, and the whole family was now available to him. He executed them, systematically. Every male member of House Strong at Harrenhal, from Sir Simon down through the last boy. The pile of heads measured 3 feet high. No one was spared, except Alice. She alone walked out of it alive, because Aemond had already decided she was something different from everything else at Harrenhal. He departed with Criston Cole's forces marching south and Aemond taking Vagar north and west, ranging across the Riverlands with a single stated strategic purpose: deny resources to the Blacks, burn the settlements that supported Rhaenyra, destroy the supply lines and the granaries and the forges and the infrastructure that allowed the Black faction to project military power through the Riverlands, force their logistics to collapse by making the territory they depended on uninhabitable. The strategy had military logic. Daemon had done something similar in his earlier campaigns. Strategic destruction of enemy infrastructure is a legitimate tool of war in a world where armies run on local supply chains rather than long-distance logistics. But the execution of Aemond's Riverlands campaign exceeded what military necessity required. Because Aemond was not only doing this for strategic reasons, he was doing it because he had been humiliated, and the fire was the only thing that felt like an answer to the humiliation. He was doing it because after Harrenhal's fall and King's Landing's fall, the accounting he had been running his whole life demanded payment from somewhere, and the Riverlands was where he was. Old Willow burned, White Willow burned, Hog Hall became stone and ash. Small settlement after small settlement saw Vagar's shadow cross their streets in the morning and were gone by evening. The small folk who had nothing to do with the dance except that they happened to live in the wrong place under the wrong allegiances, watched their world reduced to smoke and ran for whatever cover existed. Some of them made it, some of them did not. Yet the histories record the villages by name. The people are mostly nameless. Aemond became the terror of the Trident. This is not a name given with admiration by historians. It is the name the small folk gave him, in the way that people name the things they fear, the way you give a name to a storm or a disease, because naming it is the only control available to you. He descended from the sky and rained fire and disappeared, only to strike again 50 leagues away the next day. Daemon and Nettles, who had been sent specifically to hunt him, could not find him. He was too mobile and too unpredictable, and he had the advantage of a dragon whose size and speed could not be matched by anything the Blacks had available. And the campaign served its strategic purpose up to a point. It made the Riverlands significantly less useful as a logistics base for the Blacks, denied them revenues and supplies, and kept Daemon focused on a problem he could not solve, rather than on consolidating the position he had won. But it also consumed time and dragon endurance that might have been better directed at high-value strategic targets, and it generated a level of hatred among the civilian population that would make reconstruction of Targaryen authority in the Riverlands much harder after the war, regardless of which side won. None of this was how Aemond thought about it at the time. He was not in a mode that permitted the kind of second-order strategic thinking that asks what effects your current actions will have on the post-war settlement. Yet he was in a mode that wanted to leave marks, that wanted to be undeniable, that had found, finally, the unambiguous form of power he had been looking for his entire life, and was using it without fully considering what it cost. Then Daemon's message arrived. He would be at Harrenhal, waiting. Section 9. Alice Rivers and the Witch at Harrenhal. The question of who Alice Rivers actually was is one that the historians of Westeros argued about during the dance itself, and for generations after it, and never resolved. She appears in the sources as multiple different things simultaneously: a simple serving woman with an interest in herbal potions, a bastard daughter of House Strong, a genuine seer with prophetic abilities, a sorceress who used love magic to bind men to her service. It's a witch queen who would eventually claim Harrenhal as her own domain after everyone else she was associated with had died. She is all of these things in different accounts, and none of them definitively in any single account, because the people who knew her were themselves unreliable for various reasons, and because the things she allegedly did are precisely the kind of things that generate unreliable testimony. Septon Eustace, who tends toward the skeptical reading of magical events in the dance, considers her a woman of sharp intelligence and limited morals who successfully constructed a mystique around herself, using whatever knowledge of potions and human psychology she had accumulated at Harrenhal. Mushroom, whose accounts are vivid and often insightful and frequently completely fabricated for entertainment value. It describes her as a genuine enchantress of considerable power who used supernatural means to bind both Sir Criston Cole and Prince Aemond to her bed, controlling them for her own purposes. Grandmeister Munkun offers the middling position. She was a serving woman with some knowledge of herbs and a tendency to claim more knowledge than she possessed, who benefited from the credulity of powerful men who needed someone to believe in. What is certain, she was at Harrenhal when Aemond arrived. She survived his massacre of House Strong, the only person he specifically spared. She became his bedmate, and then became something that even the most careful historians struggle to describe in terms that do not shade into something more than that. She traveled with him. She kept him from strangling a squire who brought bad news. She appears, in every account that mentions her alongside him, as a stabilizing presence in the life of a man who was becoming increasingly destabilized. Ewan Mitchell's discussion of what Alice Rivers represents in Aemond's story is one of the most humanizing things he has said about the character. He returned to the idea of surrogate attachment, the theory that Aemond, unable to receive the unconditional love he needed from the people who were supposed to provide it, found versions of it in substitutes. In Vagar, the she-dragon who accepted him when the system that was supposed to provide him a dragon had failed. In Sylvie, the brothel keeper who provided something maternal in a context stripped of its political complications. And in Alice, who came to him in the wreckage of his military campaign and stayed. And there is a version of the Alice story that is pure power politics. She was a woman of limited options in a castle full of men deciding her fate, and she found the man with the most power in that castle and attached herself to him as the only available survival strategy. That reading is probably partially true. People in desperate circumstances make strategic choices, and Alice was absolutely in a desperate circumstance. Every male member of her family had just been executed on Aemond's order. She was alive because Aemond had chosen to spare her. Attaching herself to him more completely, making herself useful and then indispensable, was the rational response to that situation. But there is also the Aemond dimension to consider. Aemond, who lived by the code of never attaching himself to anything he was not prepared to walk away from immediately, became, in Alice's company, someone who could not do that. The histories say it plainly. He had become besotted with the Rivers woman, to such an extent that he could not bear the thought of leaving her. This is remarkable. This is the same person who had spent 20 years making himself into something that did not have weaknesses, who had converted every vulnerability into an armor panel, who had refused to let anyone see him hurt since the night at Driftmark. And here he was, besotted with a woman that every unreliable narrator had a different take on, unable to leave her even when the strategic situation required it. She saw things. This is the element of the Alice account that resists the purely rational explanation. She saw Daemon in fire, in pools of water, in storm clouds. She told Aemond where to find his uncle. When Aemond describes this to Daemon before their final duel, telling him that Alice saw him in these visions, there is no quality of embarrassment or doubt in how he says it. He believes her. He has been living alongside her long enough to have evidence that her seeing is real. Whatever evidence that is, he found it convincing. Alice was pregnant when Aemond decided to answer Daemon's challenge. She claimed the child was his. She traveled with him to Harrenhal for the confrontation, which is either the most extraordinary act of trust in a terrible situation, or evidence that she knew something about the outcome that she did not choose to share with the man she was presumably trying to protect. The histories do not tell us which. They tell us she was there, and that Aemond helped her down from Vagar's back when they arrived, and that before he mounted the dragon for the last time, he kissed her. My Alice. The possessiveness of that phrase, the intimacy in that phrasing from a man who had kept himself from intimacy as a survival mechanism for his entire adult life, is the thing that stays with you about this relationship. He called her his, not as property, but in the way you use possession when you mean connection, when the possessive pronoun is doing the work of expressing something you do not have another word for. My Alice. The same word a person uses when they say, my family, my home. The word that says this is the thing I did not know I was missing until I found it. After Aemond's death, she claimed Harrenhal. She declared she had married him in secret. She presented a child she said was his true-born son, and the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. She held the castle against attempts to remove her for years, in the aftermath of a war that had killed almost everyone of significance, using means that the chroniclers argue about and cannot agree on. Men who came to challenge her authority died under circumstances that witnesses described differently, depending on whether they believed in magic or did not. A captured loyalist returned to Castle Derry with a message from Alice, warning that anyone who approached Harrenhal without submitting would die, and then choked to death in front of witnesses while they laughed at his story. The laughter stopped quickly after that. Alice Rivers ruled Harrenhal as what the small folk called the Witch Queen for years after the dance. Whether she was a witch in any literal sense, whether the marriage to Aemond was real, whether the child was actually his, whether any of the supernatural elements attributed to her were genuine or constructed, none of these questions were answered before the winter fever in 133 AC interrupted the efforts to resolve them. The histories end there, with Alice still at Harrenhal, still claiming to be the widow of the Terror of the Trident, still presenting a child whose claim to Targaryen blood could not be definitively confirmed or denied. It is one of the great unresolved mysteries of the dance. And it is deeply appropriate that the one person in Aemond's life who got through the walls, the one person he called his, is also the person whose nature the histories cannot pin down. Mystery found him when he was not looking for it. He kept it until the end. Section 10, The Battle Above the God's Eye. A death worthy of legend, Daemon Targaryen had been waiting at Harrenhal for 13 days when Vhagar appeared in the sky on the afternoon of the 14th. He had come alone, as he had promised, and he had spent the waiting days in solitude, the castle largely emptied of the squatters who had been sheltering in its ruins when he arrived. Each evening at dusk, he had walked to the weirwood in the Godswood and cut a mark into the white bark, 1 mark per day, tracking the time with the precision of a man who does not trust clocks when there are older methods available. Those marks are still visible in accounts from lords who ruled Harrenhal in subsequent centuries. 13 deep cuts in the white bark of the heart tree, each still bleeding fresh each spring according to those who claim to have seen it. The choice to wait at Harrenhal rather than hunt Aemond through the Riverlands speaks to something about Daemon's understanding of his nephew that Aemond himself might not have fully acknowledged. Daemon knew that Aemond would come to a direct challenge. He knew that the thing Aemond needed most in the world was to face Daemon specifically, to beat Daemon specifically, to be measured against the uncle he had always measured himself against and found himself superior. The desire for that confrontation was not simply strategic. It was personal in a way that Daemon could predict because he understood it from the inside. He had spent his own life needing to prove himself against men who were supposed to be better than him. He recognized the shape of that need in someone else. The brief conversation they had before the duel is one of the most densely packed passages in all of Fire and Blood, every line carrying weight beyond its surface meaning. Daemon asked who told Aemond where to find him. He expected the answer to be a spy, a network, a standard intelligence operation. Aemond said it was Alice, that she saw him in fire and water and clouds. She sees much and more. Daemon, who had his own experience at Harrenhal of Alice's ability to penetrate defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable, received this without visible surprise. And then Aemond said the last thing he said before they mounted their dragons. "You were a fool to come alone." The words were meant as a statement of strategic fact, what they communicated. It, in the full context of who Aemond was and what he needed, was something more complicated. He needed Daemon to acknowledge the disadvantage. He needed the acknowledgement to be external confirmation of what the numbers suggested, that Vhagar was 5 times the size of Caraxes, that Aemond was at the peak of his capabilities, that Daemon was an old man riding a dragon whose injuries from Rook's Rest had not fully healed, that this fight was not a fair one and should not have been. He needed Daemon to know that Aemond knew all of this and had already won before the dragons left the ground. Daemon looked at him, said nothing that the histories record, mounted Caraxes. The sun was at the horizon when they flew. The sky over the god's eye turned through every shade of red. The lake below them, fed by the river that ran beneath Harrenhal's walls. It was flat and dark and enormous, reflecting nothing but the color of the sky. Small folk on the shores who saw the two great dragons rise into the sunset knew what was about to happen, the way you know when you hear thunder a long way off. The fact and the feeling of it arriving together before you can fully think about either. The dragons' shrieks were heard from a dozen miles away. The fire they breathed was bright enough that people farther away than that, people who could not see the lake, looked up and thought the clouds were burning. Caraxes dove on Vhagar from the side of Aemond's blindness. The bloodworm coming out of the glare of the setting sun, on the left, where the sapphire eye was, where there was no eye at all. This was not, by most scholarly readings, a meticulously planned tactical deployment. It was demon finding, and in the heat of engagement, the one angle from which a smaller and already damaged dragon could approach the largest living creature in the world and have a chance of doing meaningful damage before Vhagar reacted fully. The approach from the blind side was the only approach that might work. Daemon took it. The collision was described, by the few witnesses close enough to see it, as a sound they felt in their chests before they heard it with their ears. The bloodworm hit Vhagar with the force of something that had given up the accounting of risk and damage in favor of a single, committed attack. They locked together immediately, grappling in the air above the lake, fire pouring between them, both sets of jaws finding purchase on the other's body. Caraxes' teeth found Vhagar's neck and sank deep. Vhagar's claws tore open Caraxes' belly. Vhagar's teeth tore away one of Caraxes' wings. Caraxes bit deeper into Vhagar's neck. Deeper, even as the injuries being done to his own body should have made continued aggression impossible. Both dragons fell. Locked together, pulling at each other and pulling each other down, they fell toward the god's eye. The water rushed up toward them. The fire was still there, still burning, on the surface of this falling entangled mass. And then Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, 60 years old and falling from the sky on a dying dragon, swung his leg over his saddle and jumped from Caraxes to Vhagar. The sword in his hand was Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had been his for most of his adult life. He drove it into Aemond's empty eye socket, the socket that had been empty for 9 years and covered in blue stone for 9 years. The space where the eye was that Lucerys took in the dark at Driftmark. The space that Aemond had converted from a wound into an identity. Dark Sister went through it so hard that the point came out through the back of the young prince's throat. The dragons hit the lake. The impact sent water shooting into the air as high as Harrenhal's Kingspire Tower. Caraxes lived, barely, impossibly, crawling from the lake with his entrails falling from the wound Vhagar had given him. Missing a wing, dying anyway but dying on the shore rather than under the water. He made it to the walls of Harrenhal. He died there. Vhagar sank. She was found years later at the bottom of the god's eye, her enormous body having settled into the lake mud in a position that looked almost like rest. Aemond's armored bones were still in the saddle, chained there by the straps he had fastened so carefully before the fight. Dark Sister was still in his skull, up to the hilt in the empty socket. The Valyrian steel blade that did not rust or dull, even after years underwater. He had not fallen free. He had gone down with her, held fast, the way he had been holding on since a 10-year-old boy had hauled himself up the side of a dragon in the dark and refused to let go. Daemon's body was not found. The lake kept whatever remained of him, which is either the cleanest and most fitting ending possible or the beginning of a story that the singers used for centuries afterward, that he survived, that he found nettles, that he lived out his days somewhere beyond the reach of the war that had consumed everyone around him. Aemond Targaryen was 20 years old. He had done more in those 20 years than most men do in 60, and most of what he had done would follow Westeros into its next century. The sword through the empty eye socket is the kind of thing that myths are made of. The wound that had made him what he was returned to end him. The eye he lost at 10 years old opened the space that killed him at 20. The accounting, which Aemond had kept so carefully and so long, was settled in the cruelest of terms by a man old enough to be his grandfather, who found the only angle of approach that worked and used it. He was still chained to Vhagar when they found them, still there, still holding on, even years later, even under the water, even with Darksister in his eye. He always did hold on longer than anyone expected. In Section 11, Legacy, Why History, fears the name Aemond. The aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons was, by almost any measure, catastrophic for House Targaryen in ways that would take generations to fully manifest. The dragons died. Not immediately, not all at once, but over the years of Aegon III's reign, the surviving dragons dwindled and failed to reproduce, and eventually were gone entirely, leaving the dynasty without the singular advantage that had distinguished it from every other power in the known world. Aegon III, the Dragonbane, who had survived the dance as a child by watching his mother die and his world burn, grew up to be a haunted and withdrawn king who may or may not have contributed to the extinction of his own family's greatest asset. The Targaryen dynasty did not fall immediately after the dance. It lasted another century and a half before Robert's rebellion ended it. But the crack at its foundation that the dance created was the crack that eventually widened into the collapse. Aemond contributed to all of this. He contributed directly and specifically through the things he did during his regency and his Riverlands campaign. He left King's Landing defenseless to pursue his own glory. He used the war's license to pursue personal vengeances that served no broader strategic purpose. He elevated his need to beat Daemon over the collective Green War effort, choosing to face Daemon alone rather than waiting for reinforcements that might have made the outcome different. He was, by every honest assessment, a brilliant individual operating in a way that was structurally problematic at exactly the level where it most mattered. And yet, history fears his name in a way it does not fear the names of simply bad rulers or simply failed commanders. There is something else in the legacy of Aemond Targaryen that resists reduction to the things he did wrong. The comparison to Maegor the Cruel is one that the histories make, and that modern analysis revisits regularly. The parallels are real on the surface, both second sons, both riding the largest dragon of their era, both governing through a combination of genuine capability and outright terror, both leaving trails of destruction across the realm that took generations to repair. The historical shorthand of calling Aemond a second Maegor was emotionally convenient for the people on the black side of the Sur who needed him to be simply a monster. It absolved them of the more uncomfortable recognition that he was something more specific than that, and that the conditions that produced him were conditions their own side had contributed to. But the comparison is also imperfect in ways that matter for understanding what Aemond represented. Maegor took pleasure in suffering. Maegor burned and tortured for the pleasure of burning and torturing, finding satisfaction in the exercise of absolute power over others that went beyond any strategic rationale. He was cruel in the literal sense. He inflicted pain and enjoyed the inflicting. His cruelties were personal and sadistic in a way that made the historical record about him genuinely disturbing in its particulars, and that distinguishes him from Aemond in a fundamental way that simple surface comparison misses. While Aemond was calculating even when the calculations were wrong, he was not Maegor. He was something the Targaryen vocabulary did not have a precise name for. Aemond was not this. His violence had purposes, even when those purposes were too personal to be described as strategic. The execution of House Strong was revenge and deterrence, not sport. The burning of the Riverlands was destruction of enemy infrastructure, not atrocity for its own sake. He was cold and ruthless and willing to pay any price in other people's suffering to achieve his objectives. But the objectives were always there. He was not Maegor. He was something that the Targaryen historical vocabulary did not quite have a word for. A second son of extraordinary capability operating in a political structure that had no legitimate place for him, and turning the denial of that place into a campaign of forced recognition by any means necessary. That is the thing that people have feared about the name Aemond Targaryen in the centuries since the dance. Not the fire precisely, though the fire is part of it. The fear is more fundamental than that. It is the fear that exists in any system that produces exceptional people and then fails to accommodate them. The fear that the person you overlooked and dismissed has been watching you, has been keeping accounts, and will eventually demand settlement on terms entirely of their own choosing. Aemond was the proof of something that institutional power structures always prefer to pretend is not true, that the person in second position is sometimes genuinely better suited to first position, And that the structure's insistence on ignoring this does not make it less true. It simply makes the consequences of the truth's eventual manifestation more severe. Every small court in every century of history has its version of the dragonless second son who should have had the dragon. Most of them do not claim Vhagar. Most of them drink themselves to death on the disappointment or channel their abilities into something the structure can accommodate. Aemond was the one who chose differently, and the choosing of it changed the shape of the world. His personal legacy, separate from the strategic and political legacy of the dance, is visible in the things that outlasted him. Alice Rivers held Harrenhal for years after his death, her claims unresolved, her child's identity unknown, her own nature disputed. The story she told, that she had been his wife, that their son was the heir to the Targaryen line through Aegon II, is not something the histories confirm or deny with certainty. It is possible that she was lying. It is possible that she was telling the truth. It is possible that Aemond, who gave nothing to anyone he was not prepared to walk away from, gave her what she claimed he gave her, and that somewhere in the deep water of the God's Eye, there is a truth about him that the lake never released. His weapons outlasted him. Dark Sister was recovered from his bones when Vhagar was found. The Valyrian steel blade returned to the Targaryen treasury, passed down through subsequent generations, occasionally lost and occasionally found again, as Valyrian steel weapons tend to be. His sapphire eye was presumably at the bottom of the lake with Hezemnahin when they found his bones. His sword, though, kept going. That is fitting. That is deeply and strangely appropriate. The boy who trained obsessively and became the greatest swordsman of his generation, who surpassed the man who taught him, who built his body into a weapon because the system that was supposed to give him a dragon had failed him. His sword outlived him by generations. The thing he built himself into persisted. The final image that history gives us of Aemond Targaryen is his skeleton, still in the saddle, still chained to Vhagar, with Dark Sister in the empty eye socket. It is not an image of defeat. It is not an image of triumph either. It is an image of completion, a life that was always organized around holding on to the dragon he claimed, holding on to the identity he built, holding on to the accounts he kept, and the ambitions he nursed, arrived finally at the only form of holding on that has no end. He held on all the way to the bottom. That is why history fears the name Aemond Targaryen, not because of what he destroyed, but because of what he was willing to become in the process of making himself undeniable, because of the specific and irreducible truth that he embodied, that if you consistently fail to see the person most capable of being seen, you are not committing only an injustice. You are creating a force that will find its own way to be seen, on its own terms, at a cost you did not budget for. He was seen. By the end, the Riverlands saw him. The realm saw him. The lake has him now, still and permanent, at the bottom of a still and permanent place. And the name they gave him, the Terror of the Trident, the Kinslayer, Aemond One-Eye, sits in the histories with the kind of weight that names acquire only when the person they name was absolutely, completely, irreversibly real. He was that. He was absolutely real. He was also, somewhere underneath all of it, still the boy who was given a pig in lieu of a dragon, and who decided, in the full clarity of his 10-year-old's fury, that the world was going to be different from this point forward. It was. If you have been here with me for the entire length of this story, I want to take a moment before the end to genuinely thank you for that. Not in the reflexive way that content creators thank audiences, but in the actual sense. This was a long journey through a complicated person. And the people who stay for the full journey are the ones who make it worth taking. Aemond Targaryen is not a comfortable subject. He is not someone whose story resolves into the clean satisfaction of either simple villainy or clear heroism. He is someone whose life forces you to hold multiple true things simultaneously and resist the urge to collapse them into a single verdict. He was brilliant and cruel and capable and self-destructive and deeply, irreducibly lonely in a way that the armor he built over himself only partially hid. He did things that cannot be excused. He was the product of conditions that cannot be ignored. Both of those things are completely true, and neither one cancels the other out. That kind of complexity is, I think, what the best stories are for. Not to make us feel good about the people we admire, or bad about the people we oppose, but to make us see fully and carefully, to resist the flattening that happens when we need characters to be simple so that the accounting of the story comes out clean. Aemond resists that flattening. He resists it even in his absence, even in the centuries since his death, even when the historians who study him would clearly prefer a simpler man to analyze. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. Tell me which part of this story stayed with you. Tell me whether you think he was ultimately a victim of the life he was given or the author of his own catastrophe, bearing in mind that both are true and that the tension between them is the whole point. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is and what you are drinking or what you are not drinking, because the people on the other side of this screen are the reason these stories get told. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, I am going to ask you one more time, genuinely and directly, please subscribe. The algorithm does not do these videos any favors unless the people who watch them tell it to, and subscribing is the clearest way to do that. It takes 2 seconds, it costs nothing, and it means that the next time I spend weeks researching and writing a story like this one, it reaches the people who would want to hear it. Until next time, may your fire be warm and not wild. May your accounts stay settled, and may you always look carefully at the quiet ones in the corners of the rooms you occupy, because they have been looking at you for longer than you know. Good night. Script written for Q on Got. All lore based on Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin and House of the Dragon. HBO. This channel is not affiliated with HBO, Penguin Random House, or George R.R. Martin. Narrative interpretation and editorial analysis are entirely original. Addendum: The Mirror and the Rogue Prince, Aemond and Daemon as reflections. There is a structural device that House of the Dragon uses deliberately and with considerable skill, and it is the placing of Aemond Targaryen and Daemon Targaryen in deliberate, sustained, intentional parallel throughout the narrative. From the smallest visual choices, their shared habit of wearing their silver hair long and loose and unrestrained, their parallel tendencies toward physical stillness interrupted by sudden decisive violence, their identical relationship to the second son dynamic that defines their respective positions in the Targaryen succession, to the largest narrative ones, the structural mirroring in their paths to power and the structural mirroring in their final confrontation. These two characters are constructed as reflections of each other. Understanding this reflection is essential to understanding Aemond fully, because so much of who he was and what he did was organized in relation to the template that Daemon represented. Daemon Targaryen was everything Aemond admired and wanted to become before he had the vocabulary to articulate what he admired or why. He was the second son who had taken the position and made it into an identity rather than a limitation. Where the second son role in most Westerosi noble families meant graceful diminishment, training for the sword and the service, stepping aside for the heir with as much dignity as the situation permitted, Daemon had converted his secondness into a kind of superpower, making the ambiguity of his position, the fact that he was always just outside the center of power without being quite outside it, into a source of genuine and cultivated menace. He was the rider of Caraxes, the blood worm, a dragon of distinctive and unsettling appearance that suited its owner's particular personality perfectly, in the way the best dragon rider pairings always do. He was a fighter of extraordinary ability who had trained seriously and fought genuinely and accumulated the kind of martial reputation that comes from actual testing rather than tournament performance. He was a political schemer of genuine cunning who had navigated 40 years of Targaryen court politics with enough success to have survived, married the woman he wanted, fathered the children he wanted, and positioned himself at the center of the war his wife was fighting. And crucially, he had earned his legend rather than inherited it. Everything about Daemon was something he had built, or taken, or won through the application of his own capabilities. The sword arm, the dragon bond, the reputation for violence that was more deterrent than actual track record because he had cultivated it carefully. He had done the work. He had done it unapologetically and without asking permission. And the result was a man who was genuinely feared and genuinely respected by people who had seen enough to know the difference between constructed menace and the real thing. Aemond saw all of this and saw also the shape of his own situation and his own ambitions in it. When he studied military history, he was building what Daemon had built through experience. When he trained obsessively at arms, he was developing what Daemon had developed. When he cultivated his own presentation, the measured silence and the quality of violence held in disciplined reserve, the specific kind of presence that does not announce itself but fills a room anyway, he was making choices that rhymed with the choices Daemon had made, filtered through his own nature and his own history. And the parallel was noticed by the showrunners, noted in detail by the actor playing Aemond, and visible to any viewer who watched both of them in the same space and understood what they were seeing. Ewan Mitchell made a deliberate acting choice early in production that reveals something essential about the psychology he was building for Aemond. He decided to avoid making direct eye contact with Matt Smith's demon throughout the series. He would not look at him directly in scenes they shared. He would look past him or around him or at a point above his left shoulder, never meeting his gaze straight on. The choice was rooted in careful characterization. Aemond admires Daemon too much and fears the admiration too much to allow himself to engage with it directly. As the uncle who is everything Aemond most wants to be seen as is also the person whose acknowledgement would cost the most to seek. Looking at Daemon directly would mean acknowledging the admiration, and acknowledging the admiration would mean revealing something real and vulnerable in the presence of the one person Aemond needed most to appear invulnerable before. The irony embedded in this dynamic is beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Aemond had spent his entire life looking for recognition. He wanted desperately to be seen, to be valued, to have someone understand the full measure of what he was. And the one person in his world who was probably capable of giving him that recognition, who operated at a level where genuine understanding of Aemond's capabilities was possible, was the one person he could not allow himself to ask. Because asking Daemon meant showing Daemon. Because showing Daemon meant being vulnerable before someone Aemond had organized his entire life around not being vulnerable before. Daemon understood all of this too. The experience of being Daemon Targaryen, of having spent 40 years building yourself into a particular kind of force, gives you a specific kind of knowledge about the people who are doing the same construction. You recognize the project. You recognize the particular combination of capability and hidden wound that produces the specific configuration of someone like Aemond. And Daemon, being Daemon, used this knowledge. The challenge he sent to Aemond, the declaration that he would be at Harrenhal waiting, was not a straightforward military communication. It was a precision instrument deployed with full knowledge of exactly which part of Aemond it was aimed at and exactly how he would respond. He pulled the string that Aemond could not resist, because some strings are tied to the parts of yourself that intelligence does not protect. The parts that formed before the intelligence had a chance to build its defenses around them. The hunger for recognition that had been there since the pig. The need to prove himself against the template he had been measuring himself by for as long as he could remember. Daemon understood what he was doing. Aemond walked into it anyway, because he could not be Aemond and not walk into it. That was the trap, and the logic, and the tragedy of it all at once. The final confrontation between them, above the God's Eye at dusk, is the meeting of a man who had spent 40 years figuring out exactly who he was, including the limits of himself and his willingness to sacrifice himself, with a man who had spent 20 years building himself in the shadow of the first man's example and had not yet arrived at that final reckoning. Daemon stripped away his saddle chains because he knew he might need to jump. He accepted the possibility of his own death because accepting that was the only way the attack could work. The only angle from which a smaller and already damaged dragon could reach Aemond through Vhagar's defenses. He committed completely because incomplete commitment was suicide at that angle. Aemond fastened his chains because Aemond protected himself. Because protection was the lesson Driftmark had taught Aemond at 10 years old. It's the lesson that being secured against every contingency was the only way to survive in a world that had already taken his eye and would take more if he let it. He had built the habit of security into the automatic and unconsultable level of himself, below decision and above instinct, where you do things because you always do them and cannot quickly retrieve the original reason why. The security killed him. The precaution became the vulnerability. He was chained to Vhagar when she fell, and the chains meant he could not get clear, and the lake took them both. This is the specific and perfect cruelty of how Aemond Targaryen died. Not that he lost the fight in the conventional sense, not that he was outmatched militarily because the raw numbers gave him every advantage, but that he lost to the application of exactly the kind of complete self-sacrifice that he had never been able to allow himself. The walls that had kept him safe his whole life were also the walls that made him the only available target for the one attack that could work. He was defeated not by Daemon's strength, but by his own greatest construction, the self that could not be harmed, because it could not be reached, now literally anchored to something that was going to the bottom of the lake, whether he was attached to it or not. The mirror cracked on contact. Both pieces fell into the water. The stories they tell about both of them afterward, the songs that grew around them in the centuries following the dance, they have this quality of acknowledging that what was lost above the god's eye was not simply two lives, but a specific and unrepeatable collision between two versions of the same fundamental type of person, arriving at the same point from opposite directions and canceling each other out with perfect mutual destruction. Addendum 2. What he left behind. The longer shadow. The aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons was, by almost any coherent measure, a catastrophe for House Targaryen that took generations to fully manifest in the external conditions of the realm, while being immediately visible in the internal conditions of the dynasty. The dragons died, not immediately, not all at once, but progressively across the reign of Aegon III, the Dragonbane, who had survived the war as a traumatized child and grew up to be a haunted and withdrawn king, in whom his own dragons apparently sensed something that made them reluctant to breed or thrive. The mechanisms of the dragon extinction are disputed, as they always are when historians find themselves unable to identify a clean linear cause for something complex and gradual. What is not disputed is that the dragons who survived the dance were the last dragons, and that the Targaryen dynasty without dragons was a fundamentally different institution than the Targaryen dynasty with them. Aemond contributed to this outcome directly and measurably. The loss of Vhagar and the God's Eye was not simply the loss of one dragon among many. Vhagar was the oldest and largest living dragon in the world, in carrying genetic and experiential capital that the population could not replace. She had flown with Visenya Targaryen during the original conquest. She had been ridden by Balon the Brave. She had carried Laena Velaryon across the free cities. She had been alive for nearly 2 centuries, through the full arc of the Targaryen dynasty's rise and beginning of its decline. When she died, locked with Caraxes in the water, the dragon population lost a linchpin that it would not recover from. The subsequent generation of dragons, the ones who hatched after the dance or who were juvenile at its end, were smaller than Vhagar's generation. And the generation after that was smaller still. The gradual diminishment that ends with the dragons dying in Aegon III's reign begins with the losses of the dance. And among those losses, none is more significant than Vhagar. The Riverlands carry their own kind of legacy from Aemond's campaign. The land itself was damaged in the ways that fire and systematic destruction always damage land. Not permanently, because the earth recovers from fire given time and rain and the seasons, but in ways that take generations, rather than years, to undo. The settlements he burned had to be rebuilt by people who had survived the burning, which means they were built by people living in the shadow of the memory of burning, in the specific way that traumatized communities rebuild, smaller, more cautious, with less investment in permanent structures that might be destroyed again, with a wariness of the sky that the older people passed on to the younger ones, along with everything else. That wariness, it's that specific sky consciousness, is documented in the accounts of travelers passing through the Riverlands in the decade after the dance. The people looked up when they heard wings. Any wings, not just dragon wings. He made them afraid of the sky. That is what the terror of the trident left behind in the places he burned. The fear of what comes from above. The knowledge, burned into collective memory, that the sky is not safe, that the thing riding the wind might be the last thing you see. This is not a metaphorical legacy. It is a documented psychological reality that persisted in specific communities for long enough that the chroniclers who came afterward thought it worth recording. Aemond did that. His campaign did that. The name he was given for it, the Terror of the Trident, was not exaggeration, it was description. It's the question of Alys Rivers' child, the alleged son of Aemond Targaryen, who may have been a bastard and may have been trueborn depending on whether you believe the marriage Alys claimed, represents a thread the histories leave deliberately unresolved. The child was real. The claim was made. The young boy presented at Harrenhal under Alys's rule, shown to the loyalists who came to unseat her as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne through his father's bloodline, was a fact regardless of the legitimacy of his claim. What happened to him after the Winter Fever and Alys's departure from recorded history is unknown. If the child was Aemond's and was born alive and survived, then Aemond's line continued past him. A grandson somewhere, a great-great-grandchild, but people who would eventually be absorbed into the general population of Westeros, or who emigrated across the narrow sea, or who persisted in some corner of the Riverlands as minor nobility with murky genealogies and occasional flashes of silver hair and violet eyes that made certain informed observers look twice before looking away and saying nothing. History loses its threads regularly in this way. Dynasties dissolve into the world. The Targaryen bloodline that the Dragon Lords of Old Valyria maintained through generations of careful breeding, keeping it pure through practices that the rest of the realm considered horrifying, eventually dispersed into the population anyway, carried by the daughters and bastard sons of men like Aemond who did not follow the strict rules. The Sapphire Eye sits in the bottom of the God's Eye Lake, probably, as the sword that killed him was recovered and passed through multiple hands before disappearing from the historical record. The dragon is dust and ancient bone at the bottom of a lake. The man is bones and armor and legend, and the legend has outlasted everything else by a very wide margin. What he actually was, what the full truth of Aemond Targaryen amounts to, when you hold all the pieces simultaneously, is this. A person who was failed before he could understand what failing meant, who built himself in response to that failure into something extraordinary and ultimately unsurvivable, who achieved real things and did real damage and loved, at least once, in the complicated and guarded way that people love, when love is something they have to work to allow themselves. He was not simply a villain in a complex world. He was a person in a complex world who made choices that cannot be fully excused and cannot be fully explained by anything other than the complete arc of his life. That arc ends at the bottom of a lake, the chains still fastened, the sword still in the eye. He is still there, in a sense, still holding on. The way he always held on, longer than anyone expected, through things that should have broken the hold before they did. You have to give him that. Whatever else you say about Aemond Targaryen, whatever moral accounting you arrive at when the full picture is assembled, you have to give him that. He held on. Addendum 3, The Sapphire in the Dark. Why we keep coming back. There is a question worth asking at the end of a journey like this one, which is why. Why Aemond? Why does this particular character, this particular prince who lived and died in the gap between what he deserved and what the world gave him, continue to generate the kind of intense interest that brings people to channels like this one in the first place? Part of the answer is straightforward. He is exceptionally well written, in both the source material and the adaptation. George R. R. Martin's Fire and Blood gives him enough texture that the imagination has room to work. The television series, and specifically Ewan Mitchell's performance in it, gives him a physical and emotional reality that makes the texture concrete. He is a character who rewards attention, which means that the people who pay attention to him find more each time they return to the material. But I think the deeper answer is about recognition, not admiration necessarily. Not the desire to have been Aemond or to have done what he did, but a recognition in the specific sense of seeing something in him that reflects something real and familiar about the experience of being human in a world that frequently distributes its resources, its attention, and its opportunities according to criteria that have nothing to do with merit or need, or the actual quality of the person receiving or not receiving them. We have all been the person without the dragon in a room full of riders. Not in the literal sense, obviously, but in the sense of being the person who showed up without the thing that everyone else seemed to have arrived with. The credential, or the connection, or the background, or the name. The thing that gets you taken seriously before you have to prove yourself. We have all had the pig moment. In the moment when the thing being communicated, explicitly or through its absence, was that you did not belong to the category of people who get taken seriously. We have all kept accounts, in the private way that people keep accounts, when the open keeping of accounts would be too dangerous, or too vulnerable, or too direct a declaration of something that the world has not earned the right to know about yet. What Aemond did with his pig moment and his account keeping is, mercifully, not what most people do with theirs. Most people find accommodations. Most people find the specific corner of the world that will take them seriously and settle into it with whatever satisfaction that offers. Most people do not claim Vagar. The extremity of his response is the extremity that makes him a story rather than simply a person. But the seed of the response, the initial conditions from which the extremity grew, those are not extreme. Those are ordinary. Those are Tuesday. The boy without the dragon is everywhere. The children giving other children pigs because it hurts them, and the hurting of them is temporarily satisfying. Everywhere. The parent who frames their child's adequacy as conditional on boldness, rather than simply being willing to see them. Everywhere. The system that distributes its most valuable resources on the basis of accident of birth, and then acts surprised when the people who did not receive them find other ways to acquire comparable weight. Everywhere and always. What Aemond carries for us is the extreme version of a completely ordinary experience, elevated to the register where it becomes visible, made enormous, made undeniable. It is put on a dragon and given fire. That is what the best fantasy literature does with the human material it works from. It takes the things that are true and it makes them too big to ignore. It takes the boy without the dragon and gives him Vagar, and then it shows us what happens when the full weight of what that boy needed, what was owed to him and what was withheld, and what the withholding produced, gets to finally express itself without limit or constraint. The expression is not pretty. The histories are clear about that, and we have been clear about that throughout this script. He burned things. He killed people. He made choices that were bad for everyone, including himself. The expression of his need was itself a catastrophe. Because needs that go that long unmet and then find a way to express themselves uncontrolled tend to produce catastrophes. But inside the catastrophe, carried alongside everything terrible and everything competent and everything brilliant, is the boy. The boy with the accounts. The boy who was given a pig. The boy who went to the beach in the dark and stood in front of the largest living creature in the world and refused, absolutely refused, to back down. He is still there, in the skeleton at the bottom of the god's eye, still in the saddle, still holding on. That is what we come back for, not the villain, the boy inside the armor, the person who was there before the armor was built, and who is still there inside it, long after the building stopped mattering, and the saddle chains held, and the lake closed over everything. We come back because he deserved better, in the specific way that complicated people who do terrible things sometimes deserve better, which is to say, not that they deserve to be excused for what they did, but that they deserve to exist in a world where what they needed was available to them, and what was taken from them was returned, and the accounting never had to happen at all. That world did not exist for Aemond Targaryen. So, the accounting happened, and we sit with the ledger now, in the dark, trying to add up the columns and find the number at the bottom. And what we find instead is his face, the sapphire eye catching the light from the fire of the candle we lit to see by, and the single remaining real eye looking right back at us, still watching, still keeping accounts, still waiting for someone to see him.